Welcome back to the deep dive. So you asked for a closer look at sources dealing with foundational texts. We're talking scripture, national history,
Yeah.
and how people today are interpreting them, arguing over them, sometimes even weaponizing them.
Exactly. And the real focus isn't just what these texts say, but more about how different writers are trying to frame the truth for their specific audience. We've got three really different examples here.
Yeah, wildly different methods. There's like a aggressive debating guide, a super traditional reference book, and then a history book that completely flips the usual narrative.
Right. And the big challenge for you as you engage with this stuff is figuring out, well, whose interests are being served by each story. Because, whether it's Columbus or a specific Bible verse on a modern issue.
The way it's presented,
Yeah.
the framework, that often tells you more than just the facts listed.
That's really the core of it. We need to try and stay impartial, look at the approach just as much as the content. Because how someone argues is, well, it's just as revealing as what they're arguing.
Okay, let's unpack this then. And maybe we should start right in the deep end with the most confrontational one we've got here.
Makes sense. Let's start with Jan Fugelsang's book, Separation of Church and Hate, A Sane Person's Guide to Taking Back the Bible from Fundamentalists, Fascists, and Flock-Fleecing Frauds. I mean, that title alone.
It really sets the tone, doesn't it? It's got this very clear, very aggressive mission, basically to give modern, more liberal readers, could be Christians, could be non-Christians, the biblical ammo they need to, well, take apart fundamentalist arguments.
Yeah, it's framed as a direct counteroffensive, trying to expose what Fugelsang sees as, the inaccuracy and hypocrisy when certain groups use the Bible as a weapon, especially on the far right.
And he doesn't pull any punches, right? The
Yeah.
source material points out he jumps straight into really current, hot topics: abortion, immigration, LGBTQ rights.
And he uses scripture for this, but often, as the critique we looked at mentions, mixed with some pretty, let's say, irreverent or even deeply inappropriate humor. The goal seems to be reframing these debates using Jesus's teachings, specifically focusing on equality.
You can see that really clearly in chapter titles like Thou Shalt Not Hate Feminists. He goes into scripture, looks at women in the Bible, how their stories might have been, spun negatively or just ignored over time. He's trying to reclaim them for a more progressive view.
But this is where things get tricky. Even with that stated goal of promoting love and mercy, the way he does it, his methodology, starts to draw some pretty sharp criticism.
Yeah, the critique basically calls it an unserious approach to a serious subject. And that's not just about the language, the swearing, or the jokes. He gets into issues of, like, precision.
Right. What's really interesting is that his apparent need for a clear enemy, a villain, seems to make things muddy. He throws around terms like fundamentalists, evangelicals, Christian nationalists, almost interchangeably.
Which, if you're writing a guide on how to debate effectively, that lack of definition is a bit of a problem, isn't it?
It is. It kind of creates this vague bogeyman. The person he's arguing against often feels like a caricature. The source mentioned that straw man uncle figure you argue with at holidays.
Relying on a caricature like that, well, it doesn't really strengthen your case if you're aiming for a serious intellectual win,
Definitely not. And the other crucial point the sources raise is the lack of balance. He leans entirely on liberal theologians for his backup, but there's no input from conservative or orthodox theologians mentioned.
So if you're trying to argue that your reading of the Bible is the right one, but you don't engage with or even acknowledge the scholarly arguments from the other side,
It kind of undermines the claim to objectivity, doesn't it? It makes it feel less like an objective guide and more like, well, pure polemic, just taking sides.
So Fugelsang's book ends up being this sort of tactical handbook for fighting a culture war using the Bible, where winning the argument seems to be the main goal, maybe even at the cost of methodological carefulness. The values are love and mercy, but the approach is very much subjective, very combative.
Yeah, that sums it up pretty well.
Okay, so let's pivot now, completely away from that kind of polemical battleground. Let's look at a resource that seems to want the total opposite, like absolute structure, traditional clarity. We're moving to Timothy Paul Jones's Rose Book of Bible Charts, Maps, and Timelines.
Ah, yes. This is almost the anti-Fugelsang, in a way. It's described, I think the source said, as a worthwhile reference stuffed with facts and illustrations. The whole design is about clarity, about orthodox study. It presents itself as just the facts laid out, not an argument.
And it's super visual, right? That seems key to its approach. Yeah. Lots of charts, timelines, diagrams designed to make complex information feel simple and digestible.
Exactly. Things like biblical weights and measures, all the feasts and holidays, who the 12 disciples were. It even gives you these detailed diagrams of things like Noah's Ark or Solomon's Temple, very visual, very structured.
And that chart, How We Got the Bible, seems like a good example of its whole mission.
Definitely. It takes this huge, complex history of translation, different canons, figures like Jerome, Wycliffe, and boils it down into this neat, easy-to-follow timeline. The aim is clearly to present potentially confusing history in a way that feels authoritative and, well, simple.
But hang on. Just the act of making it simple, of structuring it that way, that involves choices, doesn't it? Even if it looks like just facts, a reference work is still defining a certain perspective. So what's the viewpoint here?
And that's where you see the built-in perspective, the bias, if you want to call it that. The authors clearly adopt a traditionalist conservative approach. The whole focus is on established doctrine, on orthodox theology. They present the common conservative interpretation as just the way it is.
Can you give an example of how that works? If they're just listing facts, how does that traditionalism show up?
Okay, well, take the authorship of the Pentateuch. You know, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible. For centuries, scholars have debated this, suggesting multiple authors, different editors over time. It's complex.
Right, the documentary hypothesis and all
Exactly, but in the Rose Book, it just lists Moses as the author, period. There's no mention of the debates, no hint of other scholarly theories.
Ah, okay. So it's not actively fighting against other views like Fugelsang was.
Yeah.
It's more like it erases the possibility of other views by just presenting the traditional one as the only one, as the settled fact.
Precisely. So if you connect it back to our bigger theme, this book tries to create clarity and orthodoxy by providing this really definitive structure. It chooses to define knowledge rather than debate it.
Yeah.
And in doing so, it locks in one specific traditional understanding of the text. It avoids the fight, yeah, but its very structure promotes a particular doctrine.
That's a really important difference. One is fighting over the narrative. The other is trying to eliminate the fight by setting the narrative in stone. Okay, let's pivot again. We're leaving religious texts now, but we're sticking with this theme of who gets to define the foundational story. Let's turn to national history, specifically Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States.
Right, and Zinn starts from this fundamental premise that basically history and ideology are tangled up together. They're not separate. So for him, the historian has to consciously decide whose interests am I serving here?
And Zinn is very upfront about his choice. He explicitly says his history is, quote, disrespectful of governments and respectful of people's movements of resistance.
Exactly. So, instead of the usual textbook history that focuses on presidents, wars, laws, big institutions, Zinn flips the script. His focus is squarely on rebellions, strikes, and protest movements.
He shifts the whole viewpoint to those who are usually, well, left out of the main story. So Columbus's arrival isn't told from the perspective of the explorers.
No, he tries to reconstruct it from the viewpoint of the indigenous peoples, using European accounts critically to piece together that experience. And the narrative centers on the lives of enslaved people, indentured servants, laborers, women, immigrants, basically, all the groups that traditional histories tend to sideline.
And that shift is obviously what made the book so influential, so powerful for so many people. But it's also the main point of criticism against Zinn, isn't it?
It really is. The core critique, as laid out in the sources we looked at, is that Zinn, in trying to correct a biased establishment history, essentially just created an opposite bias. That in trying to undo one distortion, he might have introduced another one.
How so? By leaving things out, or...?
The argument is more that he obscures certain facts, or more accurately, simplifies complex situations to fit his narrative. Critics argue he presents almost everything significant in U.S. history as basically the result of ruling class planning.
So reducing everything down to a sort of class struggle conspiracy.
That's the critique, yeah. That it becomes one great indictment for conspiracy, as one source put it. It suggests that by attributing nearly every major event or policy to the deliberate machinations of the elite, he kind of flattens the complexity of history.
You lose the nuance, maybe.
Right.
The compromises, the other ideologies, the unintended consequences, things that weren't just about naked power grabs.
That's the idea. The critique isn't necessarily saying Zinn is wrong about the oppression or the facts he highlights, but that he weaves those facts into an overly deterministic ideological framework that simplifies both the villains and the heroes. The distortion comes from the rigid interpretation, perhaps, more than the facts themselves.
Okay, so we've seen three really distinct ways to handle foundational narratives. Fugelsang using polemics to fight over interpretation, Jones using structure to try and solidify one interpretation, and Zinn using ideological reversal to fight against a dominant historical interpretation, replacing one bias with another, according to critics.
Yeah, quite the spectrum.
So, bringing this all together, what's the key takeaway for you, the listener, trying to navigate all the information out there?
Well, I think the main thing is that every source, consciously or unconsciously, is trying to define truth for you. And understanding the method the author is using, that's your shortcut to really getting what's going on.
Right. Whether it's reclaiming scripture with jokes and partisan arguments, or laying out traditional beliefs as solid fact, or flipping history on its head to focus on the oppressed, the author is always building a framework.
And these examples really show that clearly. Even something that looks neutral, like the Rosebook charts, has that built-in traditionalist viewpoint because of what it chooses not to include.
And the openly partisan books, like Fugelsang's and Zinn's, they get heat precisely because their mission seems to drive how they select and present their evidence.
So recognizing these different strategies, polemics, trying to establish orthodoxy, ideological reversal, it helps you get those aha moments. You start seeing how the narrative is being built, not just what it says. And you can ask, okay, whose interpretation is being pushed here? Whose is being ignored or protected?
It really underscores that these fights over foundational stories, they're not just about the facts.
Yeah.
They're about who gets to control the framework, the lens through which we see those facts.
Which I guess leads to a bigger, maybe more unsettling question. If Zinn is right that history and ideology are so closely linked, and if even, religious texts are interpreted based on whose interests are at stake, can we ever really get to a purely objective fact that's separate from the interpreter's agenda?
What does that mean for us when we're just trying to figure things out, trying to find reliable knowledge? If every source has an angle.
Yeah, it's a tough one. If every reference point, every narrative has some inherent perspective built into it, what does the pursuit of objective knowledge actually look like?
Definitely something to think about next time you pick up a source. We'll leave you with that thought. See you next time on The Deep Dive.